Being a child who was born and raised in the 80s, I recall being raised on a number of different fantasy films, comedy films, and animated films from that time period. In a previous video, I talked about various 80s comedies that I enjoyed a lot growing up, but today I want to talk about 80s fantasy films, and not just regular feature films and movies, but also an animated category as well for every single year of the 80s. But before we get to that point, I want to give you a little context on what you're watching right now. If you're new to my channel, I'm currently on break during a 16-hour shift working as an in-home caregiver using the treadmill in the basement, and I promised my viewers I would post every single day of the year, and myself. Kind of like an experiment, and also because I got a lot of stuff I want to say and share, and this is a means of leveling up really quick when it comes to content creation. So without further ado, let's begin. In 1980, a movie called Flash Gordon came out. Now, I wasn't terribly familiar with Flash Gordon when it first came out, but I watched it in the past maybe 5 years or so, and it's deliciously campy and completely ridiculous, and a joy to watch. I think it holds up still today if you're into ridiculousness and maybe like that Adam West style Batman kind of humor. One that resonates more with me, and I remember even more deeply from my childhood, is the animated category, which was The Return of the King, which of course was the sequel to the original The Hobbit film, I think from 78 or 79, I can't remember exactly when, but it was this animated feature for the book The Hobbit that I remember just enjoying so much as a young man, growing up watching that over and over again because we recorded it on our VHS cassettes. And The Return of the King was a very, very good sequel to that. It had a lot more music in it, of course. Frodo of the Nine Fingers. I'll spare you the rest of the song. But it was a good film all overall, and I still watch it time to time as some comfort television to fall asleep at night sometimes. Now in 1981, we had an interesting little fantasy film come out called Time Bandits. I don't know if you've ever seen Time Bandits before, or if you've ever heard of Terry Gilliam from Monty Python. But this was a very, very strange and curious movie, and it's also a part of a trilogy of films put out by Terry Gilliam. This trilogy of movies was referred to as the Trilogy of Imagination. All three films, according to Wikipedia, focus on the craziness of our awkwardly ordered society and the desire to escape it through whatever means possible, in this case, our imagination. So this is the first of the three films, and this is more from the perspective of a young boy, an 11-year-old boy. And this 11-year-old boy is in his bedroom. He's kind of obsessed with Greek history and things like that. And he has a wardrobe on his wall, against one of the walls. And a knight on a horseback comes charging through one day, and then exits, and then 6 dwarfs fall out, and there's something really weird going on with this wardrobe, and there's obviously a fantasy world on the other side, and I'll save you the details. Very, very strange film. Lots of that British humor inside of it, of course, as the Monty Python kind of feel spills on over into it. But definitely worth watching if you haven't caught it before. And then for the 1981 fantasy film animation category, we have Heavy Metal. Yeah, this one was not meant for kids because you might see some nudity, animated nudity, and also some very, very intense graphic, violent scenes as well. I wasn't able to see that as a child in the 80s. I didn't see it until maybe mid-90s when I first saw the Heavy Metal animated feature film. And I thought it was pretty good for what it was. Very entertaining, kind of dated. I don't think it's very much for the newer generation of viewers. It probably has more nostalgic value for people like in my age group than an appeal for the younger generation. But who knows? There's something out there for everyone. Maybe someone in the younger generation would appreciate it more. Then in 1982, we had an amazing flick with Jim Henson's puppeteering. We had The Dark Crystal, a spectacular film for its time, I felt at least. I think a lot of people look back at it and look at the puppeteering and kind of roll their eyes. We're so spoiled nowadays with our special effects, with our CGI and our Pixar and all that sort of thing. But back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we had to work with what we had, and it really wasn't all that much. So it was really neat to see what people did with their creativity in order to make some really neat special effects and quality films back then. And The Dark Crystal was a good film, and I still think it holds up to this day, especially for people who really like the fantasy genre of films and stories. I try to keep this list limited to one movie per the film category and the animated feature film category. But in this case, there was 2 animated films that really kind of stood out for this year. So there's of course The Last Unicorn. I don't know if you've ever seen that. I didn't see it until probably the past 7 or 8 years of my life, but knowing it came from that era, it kind of pulled on my heartstrings. It was like a forgotten part of my childhood that I never visited or something like that. And it's a favorite film by a number of friends of mine that I admire and respect, so it made the list. But the other animated feature film that I do recall seeing as a child was The Secret of Nim. Don't let this movie fool you. Just because there's cute little mice running around doesn't mean that it's not very, very dark and scary. I'm not quite sure what age kids should or should not watch that movie. I don't know, it's up for parents back home to decide. It's not up for me or censors to decide, I feel. Then 1983 happened, a fantastic year, not only because I was born, but because one of my favorite fantasy movies of that decade came out, and it was called Krull. In this film, we have a young prince who is becoming a king through the death of his father. I won't tell you how that happened. And he marries a princess who gets kidnapped right off the bat by some evil alien thing that came to that planet and teleports its fortress all across the land. And our brave young princely hero king person has to go on a venture, acquiring various people of various talents along the way, eventually acquiring this really, really cool weapon called the glaive. And it's this star piece of weapon. It looks like that. I'll just kind of pull it up. I'm not going to try to describe it here. I can pull up a picture now because of the internet. There, that's the glaive. And it pops open and closed like some sort of retractable blade, like a starfish switchblade you can throw through the air and control with your mind and your hand. Pretty cool stuff when you're just like 6 or 7 years old watching it. You're just glued to the screen like, whoa, I want one of those. And I think that pretty much made the movie cool for most people. But I like the fantasy element of it and the fight scenes and the hype and the drama and the romance. And I thought it was a really good movie as a kid, and I still enjoy it now every once in a while. And then for 1983, the animated film that came out was Fire and Ice. This is a Ralph Bakshi film. If you don't know who Ralph Bakshi is a amazing animated film artist who made other movies like Wizards back in the 70s, was responsible for the film Cool World in the 90s. He did another Lord of the Rings film, like a rotoscope kind of style. And Fire Ice is also very much rotoscope in this sense, where they took films of people acting and then animated it by drawing over the frames of people acting and made it into an animated feature that looks very realistic. Especially for its time period, it looked very realistic too. I mean, it's obvious, you can tell that it is an animated film, but the way they capture the human form and how it moves, it's no doubt that they actually had to use real actors and then paint over the film. So then that brings us to 1984, a film that made us all cry and laugh and feel ways about stuff came out, called The Never-Ending Story. And while it did lack the super awesome circular weapon known as the glaive from 1983, this 1984 film made up for it with a super awesome piece of jewelry called the Orin. It also came with a very compelling soundtrack, of course, and a song we will never forget ever if you ever watched the movie. Never-ending story. Don't worry, I won't quit my day job. And I was scouring the internet earlier today looking for 1984 animated fantasy films. I couldn't find anything. I looked up 1984 animated films. I couldn't find anything that I could relate to or that I remember seeing. I looked up 1984 animations. There was nothing. So for the 1984 fantasy film slot, we have nothing. A whole bunch of nothing. If you can find something that I could put inside this 1984 fantasy film slot for animated films, please leave a comment below and let me know what I'm missing here, because I got no ideas. But then 1985 came along, and there's 3 films I have to mention. I can't not mention any one of these 3 because they're all very much relevant to the purpose of this particular video I'm making today. We had a film called Brazil, which is part 2 of that series of the Trilogy of Imagination by Terry Gilliam. So of course I have to mention that because there's 3 of them that were made in the 80s. And then of course we have a movie called Legend that starred a very, very, very young Tom Cruise and a very, very cleverly disguised Tim Curry. You know, they say you can tell a lot about a person by which Tim Curry movies they've watched. And of course, there was another one that wasn't very popular with many people, but I grew up watching it and I thought it was just amazing. It had some very scary parts, some very comical parts, very dramatic parts, and I thought it was a great movie, especially coming from the perspective of a kid in the 80s. I'm talking about Return to Oz. And this movie was, of course, Fairuza Balk, I think that's her name. She starred as Dorothy Gale in the film, and this was her start as an actress. And we'd see her acting in movies later on, such as The Craft and various other films. She has a very, very particular looking face that you can't help but to notice and not confuse with anyone else's face. Although her name is a bit of a tongue twister, I hope I'm saying that correctly. If I'm not saying your name correctly, I apologize. I admire your acting skills and I think you're wonderful. And then in 1985, we also had an animated film called The Black Cauldron, which was released by Disney, which I never saw that coming in hindsight, looking back. At the time, I didn't know it came out because I didn't know what The Black Cauldron was until I think 1989 or 1990. We had an IBM computer and we had a video game on that computer, or a computer game, called The Black Cauldron. And that video game was my first exposure to The Black Cauldron. And it wasn't until maybe the mid to late 90s when I finally saw the animated feature film, The Black Cauldron. I think there's a lot of different reasons why many people haven't heard of The Black Cauldron, this Disney film from 1985. There were some very, very violent graphic scenes inside of it, and I don't think it really appealed to a mass audience. I think it was very much aimed toward that teenage boy demographic, and that's about it. I, for one, really enjoyed it because it kind of filled in all those mysterious gaps in the game I used to play and never actually beat from my childhood on the IBM computer. And also because I thought it was a fairly good animated film for its time. And in 1986, we saw a film that will forever hold a place in my heart. It changed my life for a number of reasons, and I'm not just talking about crystal balls. I'm not just talking about David Bowie, and I'm not just talking about Jennifer Connelly, and I'm not just talking about Jim Henson, and I'm not just talking about George Lucas. I'm talking about all of them put together to make one quality film known as The Labyrinth. Or just known as Labyrinth, really. I think a lot of us call it The Labyrinth, but the actual film title is just Labyrinth. If you haven't seen it, you gotta watch it. It still holds up to this day. A story about a distressed young lady who is sick and tired of babysitting her little brother, asks for the Goblin King to come take him away. The Goblin King actually comes and takes the baby away. The distressed young lady has to go into the labyrinth and get to the center of the labyrinth to find the Goblin King in his castle, confront him, get the baby back, and it has to do stuff. Just watch the film. It's a lot better than watching a guy on a treadmill explain it to you. And as far as 1986 animated feature films, I couldn't find anything that I remember watching as a child. However, Castle in the Sky by Hayao Miyazaki, I hope I'm saying his name properly, is an absolutely wonderful film, and that happens to be the year that that film was released. So if you like anime films, and if you like fantasy films, that's a good one worth checking out. Then 1987 rolled around and we saw one of the best movies from the 80s, The Princess Bride. Wonderful fantasy film, wonderful comedy film, wonderful every genre imaginable film. I think they did a really good job. I mean, it's not science fiction, I'll give you that. It's a romantic comedy, yeah. It's a fantasy film. It's a comedy, a regular comedy. It's an action-adventure film. The Princess Bride has something for everybody. If you haven't seen it, I don't know what you're doing with your life. And of course, we also had a film called Masters of the Universe, which starred Dolph Lundgren. He played the Russian in Rocky IV, if you recall what he looks like and who he is. And it also featured a very young Courtney Cox, who was just getting her start in her acting career, thanks to Bruce Springsteen's music video, Dancing in the Dark. And Frank Langella did an epic job playing a very, very devious and evil Skeletor. I thought the way he portrayed Skeletor was very, very well done and very scary for a young boy. And then for 1987 animated fantasy films, I couldn't find anything for that. So I decided to point out a couple of very interesting things that were released that year instead. On April 19th, we saw the very, very first feature of The Simpsons on Tracy Ullman's show. It didn't have its own show yet. I don't know how many people actually know that The Simpsons came from Tracy Ullman's show and it sprung off of that and became its own series. It was a spin-off. And then September 18th, we saw the very, very first airing episode of Ducktales. I grew up with Ducktales. I'll always love Ducktales. If you don't like Ducktales, you can go kick rocks. Ducktales is awesome. And then December 28th of 1987, we saw the very, very first release of the animated series Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I remember watching this before going to school for several years as a young man with my brother. And I remember yelling down sewers hoping that Michelangelo or Donatello or Leonardo or Raphael would come out and talk to me. Maybe even Splinter could take me in as a young apprentice and teach me the ways of the ninja. Never happened though, never happened. I don't know why. Maybe they didn't think I was good enough. Am I good enough for you, Splinter, huh? Huh? In 1988, we saw a couple of films come out, including Willow. Willow was a fantastic movie, which featured the lead actor, Warwick Davis, playing Willow himself. And we also had Val Kilmer playing Mad Mardigan, a wandering sword-for-hire, mischievous, only thinks of himself, sword buckler, swashbuckler, criminal guy, I don't know. But he was a hero in that film, and I won't tell you how or why. You gotta watch the film for yourself. Then we also saw part 3 of the Trilogy of Imagination released by Terry Gilliam. This film was called The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. Unlike Time Bandits, which was told through the perspective of an 11-year-old boy, And unlike Brazil, which was told through the perspective of a man in his 30s, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen was told through the perspective of an elderly man. Once again, according to Wikipedia, all three films focus on the craziness of our awkwardly ordered society and the desire to escape it through whatever means possible, in this case, using the imagination. Now, admittedly, I haven't seen The Adventures of Baron Munchausen all the way through, but I thought it was worth mentioning because it's part of that trilogy released by Terry Gilliam. Now I got something I gotta watch on my own list. How weird's that? And then in 1988, we had a couple of animated fantasy films, including Akira, which is arguably more sci-fi, I understand that much. But the only other fantasy film I could find from 1988 that was also animated was The Land Before Time. This film will always hold a place in my heart. I mean, the last time a scene in a movie made me cry that much was watching The Never-Ending Story when they were in that marsh. If you haven't seen it, you should watch them and cry about it. But I'll also never forget The Land Before Time because in third grade, my third grade teacher had us watch the movie, except for me. I was being punished and I was forced to sit out in the hallway while everyone else watched the movie in the class because I think I was daydreaming too much. Yeah, Mrs. G, we'll call her Mrs. G, my third grade teacher. She also thought that I was abused as a child and made me go in for psychiatric evaluation and IQ tests. And when we went in for those, we discovered that I was just very, very bored and had a high IQ. And I wasn't being abused by my parents. But I'll still never forget the time she made me sit out in the hallway and not be able to watch The Land Before Time. I got her back though. I watched that movie over and over again when we had it on VHS. Checkmate, Mrs. G. And then 1989 rolled around and we had an interesting film starring Fred Savage and Howie Mandel, and it was called Little Monsters. I don't know if this necessarily fits the whole fantasy film criteria that I was looking for to make this list here today, but it's worth mentioning. I watched it a lot as a young man growing up and I thought it was entertaining because I was a young man. And that's what entertainment was in the 80s and 90s. Stuff like this. That's all we had. And as far as animated fantasy films from 1989 goes, I can only find Kiki's Delivery Service, another film by Hayao Miyazaki. I hope I'm saying that name properly. Any anime nerds out there, correct me in the comments, please. I love being corrected. Just write anything in the comments. So hey everyone, what do you think about this list? Do you have any opinions? What should not be on the list? What should be on the list? These are films that I'm familiar with, that I grew up with for the most part. There's a couple on there, admittedly, that I'm not very, very familiar with that I put on there because I wanted to make sure I could have the animated film as well as the featured film category for each year. I was making do with what I had. But I would love to hear what you back at home have to think about it. So yeah, leave a comment below. Tell me how you feel. Oh yeah, and if you're new to my channel, you might want to check out my playlist section. I post a lot here on YouTube. As I said earlier, I post every single day of this year, in fact. And I've organized all my chaotic postings inside my playlist section. So if you spend a little bit of time, go to the playlist section, you can learn various circus and flow art skills. So if you want to learn how to juggle balls, or if you want to learn how to juggle clubs, or if you want to learn how to contact juggle, like that thing David Bowie did in the Labyrinth, you can do that there too. Or you can learn how to spin things on the tip of your finger. We call that pediddling in the industry, a very fancy word that refers to spinning things on the tips of one's finger. Or you can even learn how to play with devil sticks. If any of those things interest you, then you might want to check out my playlist section and click the tab Circus and Flow Arts Basics. Alright everyone, that's all I got for you today. Thanks very much for tuning in. I appreciate it very, very much. Remember to never give up, do your best, stay true to you, and be amazing. Thanks for watching, folks. Peace.